my choice, actually. I chose to actually enter that state because what was happening, I had 3.5 years of ministry where I was publicly telling people the truth. But the majority of people had one major fear about doing anything about it. You know what the major fear was?
Being judged. Torture.
The fear of death. It was the fear of death. They could not accept, right, that there was such a thing as a continuous existence. And so when I talk to them, the same as I'm talking to you about dealing with their emotions, right? But what's the point? Like, I'm just going to die anyway, and there's nothing after that. What's the point of dealing with your emotions if that's the case? None, really, is there? You might as well just go and do what you want right now and, you know, eat, drink and be merry, for tomorrow we're going to die. That's the attitude that many of them had. And I got to the point, after 3.5 years of ministry, that I realised that this was a major emotional blockage to any of them experiencing God's love. So while some of them had experienced trickles of God's love by dealing with their emotions, in particular many of the women that I spoke to, the majority of the men weren't. And the reason why was they were still very focused intellectually, they still had a lot of emotions in them that were focused intellectually as well. And instead of experiencing the emotions, they chose to stay in that state. They had a lot of antagonism towards women, which was causing them to actually reject God's love as well. And they were having lots of struggles to even deal with those emotions. So in the end I realised that, as it was foretold in the Bible, that eventually I would die anyway, because everybody who is a person who stands up for truth, eventually people with error want to kill you, right? That's just a natural occurrence. And I believe that's not going to be a natural occurrence of this life, because there's so many people who want truth now. But back then, everybody didn't want truth very much at all. And so what happened was that I decided that not only was I going to need to die at some point, but the process of my death would actually prove to them that there is life beyond death. And that would actually open them up so much emotionally that they would begin to receive divine love. Does that make sense? And so I tried to avoid situations where I was passing a number of times. So there were a number of times where I was harmed and so forth, but I managed to get away or heal the problem within myself that that person had caused. But on this last occasion, I was told 3 or 4 hours before the soldiers came to get me that they were going to come to get me if I stayed in that location in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I decided to not stay, to save it, and to not avoid the situation. And that's how it happened.
What emotion were you feeling at the time?
There were a lot of personal emotions that I was feeling, as well as emotions about my Father's plans and everything. The prayer in John chapter 17, sort of outlines some of the feelings that I had towards my Father. But I also had some personal emotions of sadness about my soulmate and my relationship not being able to continue in the way that it was continuing. And so I had a lot of personal emotions about making the choice to actually leave my soulmate. And that was really hard for me at the time, and very hard for her. And in fact, she got very angry with me afterwards as a result of my choice. But I felt it was necessary in order to prove to everybody that the divine love would flow. And what happened after my death is that because of their grief and everything, they began feeling lots of different emotions. And when they started feeling those emotions, they started receiving divine love, to such a point that at Pentecost there was about 120 people. So 50 days after my death, there was about 120 people who had received so much divine love that they could even speak different languages now, automatically. And that caused huge changes on the earth. Their knowing that there was no such thing as death caused huge changes on the earth as a result.
Do you think the things that were written after your passing in that time was to try and stop that consciousness from evolving? Like that controlling type of belief system that's been placed in the Bible and so on?
Yeah, it happened slowly. What happened was that obviously all of the people who were my friends, who were with me before I passed, obviously they could remember most of the teachings that I taught them. And by now they'd received some divine love into their hearts. And so they were able to then reteach those teachings to others with the correct understanding. But what happens obviously over time is they eventually died. And the people who followed them often were in their intellect rather than in their heart. And so they would then modify the teachings to suit their intellect. And so by the time 300 years came along when the Bible was actually formulated, all of the writings of the earlier times were often dismissed if they were heart-based and only accepted if they were intellect-based. And so that's why a lot of the content of what happened when I was in the first century teaching was lost. And a lot of the content of what happened when the followers who were teaching after me were teaching was lost as well as a result of that. What happened was that Constantine, who wanted to solve this problem of the destruction of half of his empire, because by this stage half of his empire was Christian, and they were still murdering them, and there were now big wars between so-called Christians and so-called other, pagans, and none of them, of course, following any of the principles I taught. But by this stage, he was trying to amalgamate his empire again, regain the power, and so he had 70 or so ministers or learned men get together and determine what should be in the Bible and what shouldn't be there. And when they did that, a lot of what got into the Bible was to do with what they could accept and what was to support their power base. So all of the women-based things all got kicked out, of course, because there was this still male domination thing going on. A lot of the writings that my own soulmate, after my passing, channeled a lot of writings that I'd channeled to her of teachings, but a lot of those got destroyed and even now haven't been made known. And so a lot of the teachings that we were taught back then were lost as a result. And that's one of the reasons why I'd always wanted to come back to reteach those teachings in an environment where people would accept them. But it wasn't until this century, this previous century, the 20th century, that we actually learned how to do that. So.